You pulled me from the clay. You set me on a rock. Call me by your name and made my heart whole again. Lifted up and my knees know it's all for your glory. I'm lost in with more reasons to sing than to feel. You pulled me from the clay, set me on a rock, called me by your name, and made my heart whole again. So here I stand, high in surrender. I need you now. Hold my heart now and forever. My soul cries out. Once I was broken, but you love my whole heart through. Sin has no hold on me, 'cause your grace holds me now. And that grace owns the ground where the grave did, where all my sin remains, left for dead in your wake. You crashed those angel gates. You left no stone unturned. You stepped out of that grave and shouldered me all the way. Come on. So here I stand, high in surrender. I need you now. Hold my heart now and forever. My soul cries out. Once I was broken, but you love my whole heart through. Sin has no hold on me, 'cause your grace owns me now. You did forgive me. Look where my chains are now. Death has no hold on me, 'cause your grace owns that ground. And your grace owns me now. 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 So here I stand, high in surrender. I need you now. Hold my heart now and forever. My soul cries out.
If you feel comfortable, lift your hands, sing it out.
So here I stand, high in surrender. I need you now. Hold my heart now and forever.
Well, good evening, Antioch. Here we come again to you via live stream. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday evening for our midweek live stream. And tonight we're going to take some time to focus in on really what is two parts. Part one this week, part two next week, which will have a little bit of a different format. But I know in this season, as we're walking through our stay-home order and during this pandemic, there's a lot of stress on relationships, and particularly on marriages. Many husbands and wives are finding themselves being around each other a lot more than they normally are because some are not working. And this can put a lot of strain, as well as the financial strain and the health strain that goes on in marriages. And so I wanted to take some time this evening to talk just a little bit about marriage. And just before we get into what we'll be looking at tonight, I want to also remind you that we have now shifting to a new online platform for our live stream. So if you're on the website and you're watching right now, you've already found that new format, which allows for chat on the side. It has some more links that we can put. It actually has live prayer requests. It's a better way for us to connect. And if you're currently watching on Facebook Live, you're welcome to continue. But we're actually asking everyone to find their way to migrate over to this new format, which you'll find a link in the comment section there on Facebook, because we feel like right now we're in two different places. We're on Facebook Live and we're on the website. We want everyone to come together in that way as well. We can all interact on the same chat if you're going to engage with that. So if you're on Facebook Live, we're asking you to migrate over. The signal will still stay on Facebook Live, but we want to try to collaborate and get everybody together on one platform via our website. So if you have a Bible tonight, I'm going to ask you to find your way to Ephesians chapter 5. We're going to look at verse 21. We'll go to verse 33 tonight. And maybe you have an app that you can access the scriptures, but it's important for you to have access to the scriptures. There'll be some things that will come up on the screen for you as well. But tonight I want to talk about the importance of how we build our marriages on the right foundation, because so many times the struggles that we experience in marriage, which can be amplified in a pandemic like right now, is that what we're dealing with isn't something that happened overnight. What we may be dealing with is something that began back at the beginning of the foundation of our relationship that keeps resurfacing because it's never been dealt with. And that always comes down to the foundational level of our relationship in marriage and how important it is to understand that foundation, the roles and responsibilities of the husband and wife, and how they work together in order to achieve God's goal in marriage. And so foundations are so important. In fact, you can see evidence and examples of this all over the place in our world and obviously in the construction industry. Back in 2008, there was this amazing tower that was built in San Francisco called the Millennial Tower. And it was touted as this amazing architectural work, and it has all kinds of different kinds of uses, and one of them actually is housing, and so people live there. But when it was built, there was a flaw in the construction at the foundational level, which wasn't realized until a few years later, and over time, the Millennium Tower started to actually sink into the soil. And since 2008, it's actually sunk 18 inches. Now, if sinking wasn't bad enough, it's actually started to lean as well. It's actually now is leaning 14 inches from when it was actually vertical when it was built. So they're trying to solve the problem and figure out what in the world is going on with this tower and why is it sinking. And they discovered that one of the issues, of course, the builder is wanting to blame that there was some water that was removed underground from a transit system that was next door, a transit center. But reality is, when they looked a little bit deeper into what was going on, is that in the construction of this tower, like many towers in San Francisco, they dig down to bedrock, a firm foundation. For some reason, the Millennial Tower, because they wanted to obviously save time and money, and they thought that they could do it on the soil that they had, they didn't drill all the way down to bedrock to anchor in the foundation. Therefore, what do you get? You get a tower that is sinking and is leaning. Why? Because at the foundational level, something went wrong. So many times in our relationships in marriage, this is exactly what happens. Something is not quite right, and we can't put our finger on it, and it comes down to, what is the foundation of our marriage? Is it based on the Bible, on God's plan, on God's outline? And if it is, then we'll have a firm and a right foundation. So that's what I really want to focus in on tonight, is this foundation that God gives us for marriage. And so Tonight we're going to look at this passage, and I know that out of this, because there always is when we talk about marriage, there's going to be questions that are going to arise from this. And so part 2 will be next week, and next week we'll focus in on actually a Zoom call that Pastor Kim and I are going to host, which will be us interacting on a Zoom call to take questions and provide some answers in terms of marriage, as well provide some resources for you, because we know this is important. So part 1 is this teaching tonight. Part 2 is next Wednesday, May 6th. In fact, you'll need to register that for that event, because we'll send you the Zoom link, and you can actually go on the church website, and there'll be a link that says marriage Zoom call, and you can click that link and then register and get the Zoom link that we'll have ready for you for that Wednesday night. But the foundation of marriage starts back at the beginning in the book of Genesis, and there's 2 particular passages that are important to understand, because the foundation of marriage is built on 2 very important concepts. The first is that marriage is built on the image of God, that marriage is intended to be a reflection of the image of who God is. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, it says, "So God created man in his own image, and in the image of God he created him," and this is how God created humanity. "Male and female, he created them." So God creates man and woman, and he does that to bring those 2 together to reflect his image, who he is. Part of his identity is reflected in not just single gender, but 2 genders brought together. And that's important, because that's the way God's designed it. But then it goes deeper if you get to Genesis chapter 2. And not only is marriage intended to be this reflection of who God is in his image, but it's also supposed to reflect the oneness of who God is. Now, we understand the Bible talks about what we give a term we call the Trinity, which is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that are not 3 different gods, but they are one God with 3, and what we'd say 3 persons, but they are all in unity. There's a oneness about them. And in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 and 25, it says this. It says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, and yet they felt no shame," or they were not ashamed. So what it's talking about here is that this one flesh principle is that concept of one to describe a husband and a wife, or male and female in the context of marriage, is the same oneness as that it describes God and who he is. So this is important, because God is the one who has created marriage. He's created male, he's created female, he's brought them together in this thing called marriage. And because he's done that, he gives us kind of the blueprint and says, hey, here's how this thing's supposed to work. And if you follow this foundation, it's not going to make your life perfect, but it's sure going to avoid a lot of the pitfalls and struggles that we all have in our marriages today. So with this in mind, I mentioned we're going to be in Ephesians chapter 5, and I will start in verse 21. I'm just going to start with there, because I want to start with the context of marriage. And it's outlined, before we get into the specifics of what marriage is, the context of marriage is described for us in verse 21 of Ephesians chapter 5. It says this. Paul writes, "Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ." Before he even gets into the role of husbands and wives, he says that the understanding of relationship, especially as we walk in the relationship of marriage, the context is what? Mutual submission. 2 things, mutual submission, and then we'll talk about reverence. Mutual submission means that it isn't, so many times we hear, a wife must submit to her husband, which is biblical, but that submission is based on a mutual submission to each other. So because of that, that's the context that we start with. And so submission means that I am willing to relinquish my rights and surrender my rights and myself to my spouse. And that is so hard for us as human beings. It's so difficult. It's a struggle for us. Why? Because one of the things that is the opposite of submission or surrender is entitlement. And see, what we end up in is in marriage, if we're to really submit, then what we are saying to our spouse is, I surrender. I surrender my rights. But many times we find ourselves living in our relationships, and we're not saying I surrender, we're saying I deserve. In other words, I do good things for you, or I do this, and then I deserve in return. And that kind of comes out of a mindset that I think is so against what marriage is really about, but we buy into it. And people have said this, and I don't think they could be any more wrong, that marriage is about a 50-50 relationship. That is so not true. It's about give and take. It's like, yeah, I'm going to give, I'm going to... No, it's actually, marriage biblically is based on mutual submission, which is surrender, which means it's 100%, 100%, which means I surrender. And in this mutual submission, if both husband and wife surrender their rights equally to each other, then you're going to find fulfillment in that relationship, because neither one is holding back or holding out or is giving a little to get in return. So it's this mutual submission. The second point of context in marriage is reverence. It says that we're supposed to submit to one another out of reverence or respect for Jesus, for Christ. And because he sets for us what the example is of what our lives are supposed to be, not only in the context of marriage, but in all of our life, is that we are supposed to surrender our rights to our spouse as Jesus surrendered his rights as God to sacrifice himself for us. So what marriage becomes, it becomes this reflection of doing what Jesus did. Jesus laid his life down. He sacrificed and surrendered his rights for all humanity. Husband and wife are supposed to do the same. Why? So that we could experience the fulfillment that God intended for us. So that's the context. If we have to start with that, because that is the bedrock of the foundation. It is mutual submission, that it's out of reverence in the example of what Christ has done for us, for both husband and wife, which leads to the second thing. Now, what I'm going to do is take some time and talk about how wives surrender their rights to their husbands and how husbands surrender their rights to their wives. Now, let me help you understand this. It isn't like, okay, wow, I have to do this or you have to do that. But I want you to understand that each one of us has to take on our roles and responsibilities in this as husband and wife in order to be what God desires for us to be. And I'll tell you right now, from a husband's perspective, there's more required of us biblically than there is of women, even though that word submit always gets thrown around. Because what I want to cover in verses 22 to 24 is there are actually three things that are clearly the responsibility of a wife to surrender her rights to her husband, but there's 5 things for the husband and what he has to do to surrender his rights to his wife. So we'll start with ladies first. So verse 22 to verse 24 of Ephesians 5, this is how wives surrender their rights to their husbands. It says in verse 22, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands." So what is Paul talking about here? Well, 3 things. The first way that wives surrender their rights to their husbands, mutual submission, is to remember it's about respect for Christ. So Paul starts off with saying, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. The way you submit your life to Jesus is the way that you're going to submit your life to your husband. Now, what does that mean for us? That means that out of understanding and respect for Christ, wives learn to submit themselves, surrender their rights to an imperfect human being out of reverence to a perfect God. And that's important for understanding because as a wife, you may desire to have a perfect husband. As a husband, you may desire to have a perfect wife, but there aren't any perfect ones. The only perfect example is Jesus. And that's why it's so important for us that this understanding of submission is to a wife to submit to an imperfect husband because they trust a perfect God. This is so important. And that means, wives, the responsibility of being married to an imperfect human being is in the process of your surrender or your submission is to do that with grace and mercy. Which means that your husband will mess up. He will do the wrong thing. He will be imperfect in his mutual submission to you, but out of reverence to Christ, show him mercy, show him grace. When Kim and I were first married, I didn't realize how much I would appreciate the fact that Kim understood the concept of mercy in regards to me as a husband. I was far from being the ideal husband when we were first married, and I had a lot of issues in my own life, and pride and arrogance and all kinds of things, and I made a lot of mistakes. But I remember as we walked through the early years of our marriage, Kim was so gracious towards me. There were times where we had challenges, but her default overall was to be merciful for me. And in doing that, there were many times that I was able to fail, and in the failures, I was able to learn in such a way, because of her mercy extended to me, that I could learn to not live that way any longer in our relationship. And so I want to encourage you, wives, as you learn to surrender and submit to your husbands, you do that with grace and mercy towards them. Because again, out of reverence to the perfect one who is Jesus, you have made a commitment to an imperfect husband who will grow in his ability to be trustworthy as you give him that grace and mercy as extended to him in your relationship. Second thing is to remember your husband carries the weight of leadership. Verse 23, it says, "For the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior." Now, when we use the term leadership, We always think leaders are more important than followers, and that is so wrong. The only leader that seems to be more important than followers is Jesus himself. But a leader is never more important than their followers, because a leader is only leader because they have followers. And this is important to understand, because leadership in marriage is not somehow about value or priority, but it's about responsibility and risk. In fact, leadership is something that nobody should vie for, because leadership comes with so much responsibility with it. When you think of responsibility and risk, what did Jesus, as the head of the church, risk? What responsibility did he take on? The example he gives to us is obviously he limited his own rights. He was God. He didn't have to come down from heaven to earth to die for us, but he relinquished his rights. He took on our failure and absorbed our failure, and also he gave his life. What? To show what true leadership looks like. And so wives, you need to remember this reality that your husband carries this weight of responsibility and leadership before God. See, because true leadership, servant leadership, is not about a position of importance. It's about a sacrificial posture, which means the husband is required to sacrifice. It's a weight that comes with marriage. In fact, that weight of leadership is so difficult, because ultimately the one who is geared and is able to handle the weight of leadership is Jesus. But in our human frailty, we're supposed to reflect that as men in terms of our marriages. And it's one of the things that when the weight of leadership weighs on somebody's life, it's heavy. Here's an example. If you've ever watched this, you can watch this with every president, unless, they work really hard with, magic hair coloring to avoid this. But almost every president, from the time they come into office, if you were to take a picture, whether it's 4 years or 8 years, you take a picture of them at the beginning of their first term, and you take a picture of them at the end of their last term, you will see it's the gray effect. They have so many more gray hairs. They probably have a lot more wrinkles. They look a lot more tired, because they have been carrying the weight of leadership and responsibility for a nation. And that's overwhelming for a human being. And the same thing is true in marriage, is that husbands are before the Lord to carry this responsibility. And because of that, there's again that grace and that mercy that should be extended to them, which leads to the third thing in verse 24 of how wives surrender their rights to their husbands. And that is, remember to let your husband lead. This is not vying for position, because God has said that the man is supposed to lead. Doesn't mean that the man is more important to God than the woman. No, there's, remember, mutual submission working together. But this understanding is to remember to let your husband lead. Verse 24 says, now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. So it's letting him lead, which means letting him lead even though he might fail in learning how to lead. Now, this is important, because this is the analogy that God gives to us, is that when the husband leads in the marriage, it works the way that God has laid it out. Again, not value or priority or better, but it's the role that God has put husbands in. But when the wife tries to take that leadership, she takes on a role, a responsibility that God did not create her to fulfill in the context of marriage. And things don't go the way they're supposed to. And the reason we know this is that the example that Paul gives here is the way that Jesus is the leader or the head of the church, not human beings. If you're a part of Antioch, you know that you've heard this from me on a number of occasions. Pastor John is not the Lord or the leader of the church. Jesus Christ himself is. Because I cannot handle the weight and responsibility. But when I take on the weight and the responsibility of what's supposed to be Christ, who is the head, everything goes crazy. And I experienced this early on as a pastor a number of years ago, when I planted a church with a group of people in Ventura, and learned the hard way that I was convinced that everything came down on me. The responsibility of the church was all on me, not realizing I was never meant to be the shepherd over the church, because there only is one good shepherd, and his name is Jesus. I was meant to be an under shepherd that served his purpose while I served people. And the same thing is true in marriage, is that God has given the responsibility to the man to lead. And so when you let him lead, you let him live in the role that God created him to live in, and then you live in the role that God's created you to live in, and then you work together in mutual submission to experience the fulfillment that God has for you. Now that's the nutshell in those three verses of what it means to experience wives submitting or surrendering their rights to their husbands. Now, guys, here it comes for you. Better gear up, okay? If you're sitting at home with your spouse right now, nobody throw elbows and say, here comes yours, okay? We know this is responsibility that God gives to all of us, but it leads from a firm foundation, a solid foundation, a right foundation, to a marriage that is the marriage that God desires for human beings to experience. So how do husbands surrender their rights to their wives? Let's read verse 25 down to verse 33. Here's the list. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. Because we are members of his body, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Again, that's the Genesis 2 passage. Verse 32, this goes on. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So here is the 5 things of what is responsible, or what is the man's responsibility, the husband's responsibility to surrender his rights to his wife. The first one is this: make a commitment to sacrifice for her. Now, I know you're thinking, man, I don't know if marriage is something I want to be a part of. But when you and I live in this mutual submission and sacrifice for each other, we find fulfillment in our marriages. It's when one doesn't and the other does that we find us in an imbalance. But the first responsibility of a man is to make sure that you make a commitment to sacrifice for it. Verse 25 says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, and he gave himself up for her. What did Jesus do? He laid down his life for his bride. Husbands, that is our responsibility. We are to lay down our life. We are to lay down our rights. We are willing to die for our wife. Are you not only willing to die for her, but are you willing to give yourself to her? Everything that you are, and that's part of what many times wedding vows include. What does that look like in practicality? It means when push comes to shove, you're willing to give up things that you think are important for the sake of her benefit. I learned this early on in our marriage before Courtney came along, which was about 4.5 years into our marriage. Kim and I had settled into kind of a rhythm of life, and Monday nights were set aside for her to hang out with her mom, because her and her mom have a great relationship, great friendship. And so every Monday they would go out and they would go shopping and do their thing. And so I got myself into a basketball league, and I loved playing basketball. So every Monday night I was out for a few hours playing basketball. Kim was out shopping with her mom. And that worked great for a number of years. And then Courtney came along. And so on Monday nights when Kim wanted to go hang out with her mom, that meant that somebody had to be responsible to care for Courtney. And I remember when it hit me and I realized, wow, okay, now we have a child. And I thought, I really want to play basketball, but the league I was in only played on Monday nights. And the night that Kim had settled with her mom was Monday night. So something had to give. And I realized that there was something more important than me playing basketball. And that was that Kim had this weekly, and it really actually became even more beneficial when we had kids, that Kim had once a week, she had a break from the kids, a break from responsibility, just to go and hang out with her mom and have a great time. And she would always come back so fulfilled in that, because she had a chance to take a breath in her weekly schedule. And I remember it was hard for me to give up basketball. It doesn't mean I gave up basketball the rest of my life, but for that season of my life, I realized I have to give away and give up and sacrifice something that I really love. Why? Because I know it's going to benefit her. Those are the decisions, guys, that we have to make, and it may be far greater than just basketball that you have to give up, but God has required of us to make that commitment to sacrifice, which is the second thing. Look at verse 26 and 27, and that is, guys, we have to value her redemption. It's another way that we surrender our rights. Going on verse 26 and 27, let me read it again. That he may sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself. This is again talking of Christ and the church and husband and wife, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, so that she might be holy without blemish. Now, guys, this is a big, very important responsibility that we have to take on. Christ gave himself fully to save the church, to bring people into a right relationship with God, and the husband's priority should always be the spiritual life and redemption of his wife. This is so important for us. That means we are to care about her spiritual growth. Why is this important? Because in my experience as a pastor, the default seems to be that women are more spiritual than men. And women, many times in the absence of men leading in terms of helping to encourage their wife's spiritual growth, take that on themselves and end up having to lead in this portion of the marriage. And that's why it's the running joke for the guys. Yeah, my wife dragged me to church, right? Neither one of us should drag each other to church, but there should be this understanding that we are to invest in our wives to help them grow spiritually. Now, some of you hear me tonight. I'm not wanting to heap guilt or shame on anybody, and you're thinking, man, I just got to work harder. But here, I'll tell you, if you don't hear anything else, you want to hear one thing tonight, husbands, how you can be a better husband to your wife. This is it. Ready? Spend more time with Jesus. That's it. The deeper you walk with Jesus, the better husband you will be. The deeper you walk with Jesus, the more you will care about her spiritual life, and you will demonstrate to her what that might look like. The more you do that, the less that she will have to carry on a weight and responsibility that God has placed on you to lead her in this area, to care for her in this area. So if you're making that commitment to spend more time with Jesus, you will see the change in your life, she will see the change in your life, and she will see that you are taking seriously not only your spiritual walk, but hers as well. So going on, the third way that we surrender our rights to our wife is to care for her physical needs. Going on verse 28 to verse 30, it says this. It says, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. So Paul's saying, listen, down to the very physical, practical needs of your wife is the man's responsibility to make sure that he cares for those things about her. And that means that he doesn't just care for the physical reality, but he always makes sure that the basic needs, not only of protection, but meeting her needs and caring for her, are always at the forefront of his responsibility. And this can be difficult because, guys, we can be selfish. We can think about our own reality and our own protection. But are we willing to do whatever it takes to make our wife feel like she has a sense of not having to carry the responsibility of meeting her own physical needs? Now hear me, ladies, because I'm not saying that somehow you're inept in this area and you can't do this, but it's a responsibility that God lays on the men. And the way that works its way out in our lives is there's a number of ways that we have to consider this, men. And I know I'm going to give you my own experience. So in the life that Kim and I have lived together, I have always told her from early on, and the only time when this was not true was when we first got married and I was in college and she had already graduated, so she was working full-time and I was working part-time going to school, that she was obviously making the majority of the money and putting me through school. But eventually after that, there became a shift, and this is the commitment that I made to Kim. I only want you to work if you want to work. If you don't want to work, then I will figure out a way to make enough money so that you don't have to work. And so we went through seasons of time where Kim didn't work. In fact, when the kids were born, we made a commitment for the first 5 years of their life that Kim didn't work. And so that meant that we had to tighten things up and we had to be really frugal and we had to make sure that we could make ends meet. But Kim had the choice to say, you know what, I'm going to stay home because I want to invest at least in the first 5 years of both Courtney and Jordan. And then once she started to work again, she did that by choice. And that's really important. And you're thinking, wow, it's impossible. We have to have dual incomes. I understand that. But there's something more something more important than keeping a certain economic level or lifestyle that we become accustomed to. It is the happiness and the fulfillment of a wife who has the ability to choose to work or not to work, not the obligation that she has to work in order for life to be sustained. A second thing is a simple thing, and I've joked about this and I've said this before, is that I always make sure that Kim drives the nicer car. So the way it usually works in our household is when we buy a car, when that car gets older and it's on the latter stages of its life, it goes to me. And then we get Kim the newer car, the nicer car. And she drives that, and then as that starts to wear out, eventually when my car breaks down, I get the hand-me-down, and so I always get the hand-me-down car. And the reason why is I want Kim to have the latest technology, the latest safety, the most reliability, the most comfort. Why? Because she deserves that, because I really care about her physical needs. I would not feel right if I was driving around in a nicer car than she is, because I want to make sure that I'm caring for her practical needs. So those are some ways that I know are possible. And I'm, again, not to put shame or guilt on any guy that's watching tonight, but just a reminder, think through, how do I make sure I put my wife's physical needs above my own to answer to what's being said here in the Bible for us. Then the fourth reality, and that is this: to surrender rights means that we need to learn to be bonded to her. And this is important. In verse 31, it says, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Again, that's Genesis 2:24 and 25. That's that concept again. Be bonded to her. And I can't underscore this more, that marriage is designed to be between not only a male and a female, husband and wife, but it's designed to be between two best friends, bonded, which means priority. Which means that, guys, we have to answer this question. Is your relationship with your wife second to Jesus? Okay, Jesus is always the primary. But is your relationship with your wife more important than any other earthly relationship that you have? Obviously, the answer should be yes. That's part of the foundation, is that friendship. I am bonded to her, which means I choose her, except for Jesus, I choose her over everything and everyone in this world. Why? Because I'm bonded to her. I'm one with her. So that means that we have to make that commitment. So that's in big things and that's in small things. Like for me, I'll tell you that Kim literally is my best friend, and people will ask me this all the time. They say, hey, you want to go do this? Or someone will offer me tickets and see if I want to go with another guy. Well, that would be fun, but my default is, if Kim wants to go, I'll go with her, because she's my best friend. There's no offense to any of my friends, but I'll just tell you, there's no greater joy for me than to do things with Kim than just do with anybody else, because she's my best friend. But I know I had to learn this bonding and this priority when we were early on. In fact, there were some times when we were dating, and then some times we were early on in marriage, that this thing called ministry that I've been a part of for so many years now, it can take over your life. It can become the priority and the number one thing that controls your schedule, your mental capacity, everything. And you have to be careful, and it's true of any career that you may be in. But early on, there's decisions I had to make sure that I didn't choose ministry over Kim, because I was bonding to her and saying, you're the priority. And there was a deep personal time that Kim went through, that which she really needed me by her side when we were dating and almost engaged. And I remember I had some very important ministry responsibilities. And I remember one night I had some responsibilities that I had to take care of. And she called me. And Kim, I'll tell you, my wife, she's not ever a needy person whatsoever, but she needed me in that particular context. And I had to make a decision. Will I step away from this group of people over here that I'm leading and I'm responsible for because Kim needs me? And I remember there was tension in me, but eventually I said, you know what? This is the right thing to do. I am in the process of bonding with her, knowing that she's the priority, so I will choose to say no. And I didn't realize at the time how important that was, because it spoke volumes to her about how she could trust me and there was safety and that I would not choose ministry over her. And then later on in her life, there were times where I had to step back and say, okay, she's the priority. Not ministry, not my career. So being bonded to her means that she is the priority. She is your best friend. She's the one that you relate to over all other in the world. And then the final thing, guys, for us husbands, how you surrender your rights to your wife, is learn to love her as you love yourself. So we know we call this the golden rule, but look at verse 33. It says this. It says, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. How does a wife respect her husband? When her husband loves her as he loves himself. Guys, you can never demand respect. You earn respect through love. And when you love your wife and you lay down your life for her and you love her as you love yourself, she will learn to respect you. It's a two-way street. It works together. So the question is this: do you take time to put yourself in your wife's shoes and to discover how you can best love her? This is so important. In fact, this is something I go through with every couple that I walk through premarital counseling, is not every person expresses and receives love the same way. Obviously, we know there's these things called love languages. There's books written about this, that we all have a primary default of how we receive love from other people. And also, we have to understand that's true of other people. How do we show them love? And in marriage, this is so important. Do you know, husbands, do you know what your wife's love language is? Do you know the way that she receives love? Because the challenge is that you may understand, maybe without even articulating it, the way that you like to be loved. And so you, in treating her as you treat yourself, you try to love her the way you want to be loved, but that doesn't communicate love to her. Here's an example. For Kim and I, we understand that we have two different kinds of love languages. We have two realities of the way that we work. For me, my primary love language is physical touch. So when Kim touches me and she'll touch my head or she'll rub my back or whatever, she'll touch me, I know she's conveying love to me. That's how I receive love. Now for Kim, hers is different. Hers is acts of service, is doing things for her. And so for her, I would love to do anything I can do to take responsibility and weight of tasks that she has to do is a huge thing for her. But if I were to always try to love her the way I want to be loved, she would probably say, okay, enough touching. And I would probably say, hey, that's great, but I could do it myself. And so because of that, you have to learn how to love each other in a way that communicates love to the other person. That's how you love them as yourself. You're giving love to them the way they understand love. So what is the love language of your spouse? And these are such an important things. But I want to conclude with this, and this is what's so important. I don't know where you're at in your marriage. You may be just a newlywed. Maybe you're engaged to be married and you're just trying to gain some things to build a foundation. Maybe you've been married for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Maybe there's been strain and struggle in your marriage, but I know one thing's for sure. It's never too late with God to go back and rebuild and redig that foundation, to go back to the beginning and start over again. In fact, sometimes we have to go back to the beginning and ask the question, okay, what did we have right? What did we have wrong? Not too long ago, we came across an old video. Yes, remember VHS videos of our wedding, our ceremony. And so Kim and I, we sat down and we watched it. And I'd remembered the ceremony, but not all the details of it. And so we laughed, and I remember even going through the vows and just walking through and remembering all the things that happened that day. But the most important thing of that whole day was not all the fanfare that went on. It was Kim herself, and it was remembering the vows that we shared with each other, remembering the commitment that we made to each other. And I remember after watching that, it took me back and reminded me of the reason why God had brought us together, the reason why we had made this deep commitment to each other, and just underscored again the gift that God had given me and Kim. And so it was reassuring to me and reminding of what God had done. And sometimes we need to go back and be reminded of what God has done in our life and be reminded of the vows that we made to our spouse. Wives, the vows you made to your husband, husband, the vows you made to your wife. Because I think sometimes, especially on a wedding day, I watch it too often, where people just treat their vows as though it's just a means to an end. Let's just get through it. Well, let's get on to the reception. Let's get on to the party. The most important part of any wedding day has nothing to do with all of what's around it. It has everything to do with the commitment that's being made. So go back and remember your vows. If you're in a season of struggle right now, I want to give you one point of kind of application, and then we'll wrap up here in a moment. But here's something that I've heard from a number of different couples who are further down in line in marriage than Kim and I are at. And I've heard a number of people say this, that it was the turning point in their marriage. When they were at each other and they couldn't get along, and there was this sense of entitlement, and why don't they change, and why aren't they better, and I'm doing this, and why doesn't she do that, and why doesn't he do this, and this argument, that they're always what we're saying to our spouse is that you need to change, you need to be better, you need to do this. And the answer is not to tell your spouse or to try to change your spouse so that they can be what you want them to be. The answer is found in a simple prayer, which is not, God, change my spouse, change my husband, change my wife. It's, God, change me. Make me a better husband. Make me a better wife. Help me to be the person you created me to be, and not worry about your spouse. Leave them up to God. Let God work on them. And if both husband and wife are praying that prayer and seeking for God to do that in their life, then they will have a fulfilling marriage. So as I said to husbands earlier, what is the one thing you can do that is the best for your marriage? Is for you to know and to experience and to follow Jesus as an individual. The more you follow Jesus, the better wife you'll become, the better husband you'll become. Why? Because you'll become more like Jesus, who is the ultimate example for all of us in all aspects of our life. So I'm going to pray in a moment. We're going to conclude our time together. But I want to strongly encourage you to do this. This is really important. that because I know there'll be a lot to unpack if you're sitting with your spouse right now to walk through, is that you will register for next week on May 6th at 7 o'clock. We'll be having our marriage Zoom call. And if you register for that, you'll get an email that will send you the link to that, and then you can be a part of that. We'll have some time for question and answer and some resource that Kim and I will share. But this is a really important time now that you probably have more time than you usually do to have with your spouse to work on your relationship, to help it to grow into what God wants it to be. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, I thank you that you, from the scriptures, are the ultimate example for both husband and wife, but also back from the beginning of time, from the book of Genesis, you have laid out for us the right foundation for our marriage. That, Lord, that our marriages are ultimately supposed to reflect your image, supposed to reflect your oneness and the bond that we have with each other. In fact, Lord, I know that our marriages are supposed to bring fulfillment in our life, not pain, not difficulty, not challenge. But Lord, they're actually supposed to help us to be more of who you want us to be. So Lord, I pray for each marriage tonight, Lord, and even those who may be engaged and moving on their way to marriage, that you would help them to take these things from your word, your blueprint, and begin to piece those things together to form the right foundation. A foundation that doesn't sink, that doesn't cause the building to lean, but it is built, Lord, on the bedrock of your word and your blueprint for our marriage. So Lord, I pray for patience, I pray for understanding, I pray for clarity, I pray for health in marriages. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, again, thanks for joining us on our midweek live stream. Continue to pray for marriages this week. I hope to see you on our live stream this Sunday, again, 9 and 11. I'm praying that you experience and you know Jesus more and more every single day of your life. God bless you.
Look where my chains are. Death has no